Great. You see the presentation, but not my notes, right? Another thumbs up.
Yep.
Great. All right. Thanks, guys. All right. Let's go ahead and get into it then. I'm going to turn my video off for now. All right. So thanks for joining. I think many here will be familiar with HWA, and there might be some who aren't. Either way, I hope you'll take something away from this, something new today. Here we're opening on a vantage of Dome Island, high up in the Hemlock canopy on Lake George. This is a nice October afternoon, I think 2020. Lake George represents what is hopefully the northern extent of HWA in the state. This infestation was discovered here a few years ago. It set up a lot of alarms as the Adirondacks host some of the richest hemlock populations in the United States. I like this photo a lot just for this nice little hemlock cone in profile here. Find it really charming. Also takes me back to that nice sunny day. As I said, most of us will be familiar with each other, but just to introduce myself, I'm Marshall Lefebvre, a stewardship coordinator with Mohawk Hudson. I've been here for just under a year now. I started on February 22nd, 2022. Prior to my arrival in the capital region, I was out in Ithaca, and I had worked for 5 years with the wonderful folks over at the New York State Hemlock Initiative at Cornell University. NYSHE, that program is often also called. It's a state and federally funded program, research program led by the great Mark Whitmore. Program is appointed with researching, developing, advising on hemlock management across the state, as well as researching the development of biological controls for HWA. A few of the images I'll be showing today were taken from my time during that program. So to get right into it, here's a map of the global distribution of all of the hemlock species. There are currently 10 species worldwide, the most recent Tsuga uleangensis having been described in 2017. That's the island of Ulang, right off the coast of South Korea. There are 4 species in North America, 2 on the west coast and 2 on the east. We see Tsuga heterophylla and Tsuga mertensiana. That's western hemlock and mountain hemlock, respectively. And here on the East Coast, we have Tsuga canadensis and Tsuga caroliniana, and a much smaller population down south. Obviously, our Eastern hemlock and the Carolina hemlock. These two kind of distinct areas of hemlock in the U.S. will become really important in a little while. I'll talk some more about that later. So let's meet the star of the show. It's Tsuga canadensis, also known as Eastern hemlock or Canada hemlock. The photo on the left shows one of my favorite characteristics of the Eastern hemlock and hemlock trees in general, which is this nice floppy leader branch. A lot of people will call it an elf hat. And that really indicates just how flexible the foliage of hemlock is. That's just the weight of the bough pulling itself over as it develops. This is a really unique characteristic of hemlocks. Just in case you ever need to pick it out of a lineup, like in this photo here, you can see that's really distinctive. I think we have a fir and a spruce on the left and the hemlock on the right. Makes it really easy to pick it out from the canopy from afar. Some more identifying characteristics of the hemlock. We see a broadly conical growth pattern. Some people might say pyramidal, tapering from the top or from the bottom up to the top. And again, you see those wispy, flexible tops, those little elf hats. The bark ranges from this brownish gray to kind of a reddish purple hue, depending on where the hemlock is actually growing and how old it is. They tend to see these deep crevices and plates on the bark as well. Also distinct are these small tan seed cones. These are the female cones of the tree. About 1 inch in length, and will often be present on the tree year-round, even if they're not active as cones. The needles themselves on the branches are alternately arranged, kind of be flat ranked, so side by side. This is the underside of the branch we're seeing here, and you'll notice these distinct white stripes on the underside of the needles. Those are the stoma of the foliage. You also notice these short, flexible petioles. That's the little stem that it connects to the twig itself. Again, these are very flexible, very lightweight, soft foliage. A few fun facts on the hemlock there. They're one of our oldest living trees in the East Coast, 800 years plus when they're lucky. It can take up to 250 years to reach maturity. One of the largest trees ever found has been over 170 feet tall and 6 feet in diameter. These are the most shade tolerant trees in the world. And they're often forming dense pure stands and becoming this climax community. So when you find a hemlock grove, that's often the dominant characteristic of the forest, and it really sets the tone for the area you're in. When I say these are the most shade tolerant trees in the world, that can be really related to their lifespan. So you might encounter a small tree in a forest, a small hemlock, might be an inch or two in diameter. That tree could easily be hundreds of years old. It just hasn't reached the sunlight yet and hasn't taken off to its full growth form. So they can persist in the understory of the forest for hundreds of years and be perfectly happy that way. Here are a couple images of hemlock forests. When they become these kind of climax communities, they become these microclimate regulators. Healthy stands maintain an average of a 2-degree temperature differential, warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer, and that's underneath the boughs of the tree. And again, that's because of that dense foliage and heavy shading. This is really important for maintaining trout stream populations. Trout populations in streams. They really rely on cool waters in our area. Also a really important seasonal habitat for wildlife, turkeys, black-throated green warblers, all of those, porcupines, deer, the list goes on. That heavy shading really helps preclude invasive species as well. Here we see the hemlock distribution in the state. Hemlock is one of the most common trees on the New York landscape. I'm told it's the 3rd most common tree. And New York has some of the highest concentrations of hemlock in the country, especially in the Adirondacks and the Catskills. Let me draw your attention to these heavily shaded areas. And I also want to point out kind of where we are, right smack dab in the middle of these 2 large pockets of hemlock. This will become really important. You'll see why. This map was put together through a collaboration with Mohawk Conservancy and the Nature Conservancy. It's showing habitat resiliency into climate change, which forms this clear pathway between the Adirondacks and the Catskill forest preserves. So again, the Catskills and the Adirondacks going right through our service area of MHLC, Montgomery, Schenectady, and Albany counties. This corridor is the likeliest pathway for a lot of wildlife and bird migrations between the 2 wilderness areas. And often that might take the form as a vector for invasive species like hemlock woolly adelgid, very prevalent in the Catskills, just getting started in the Adirondacks. And right where we are, we're kind of on the cusp, so it's important to really be mindful and active in our management. So let's meet HWA, the hemlock woolly adelgid. Adelgids are a group of insects very closely related to aphids, but the name that's a lot harder to pronounce. An easy way to remember, it might be think of the singer Adele. There she is. Now picture her covered in wool and clinging to a hemlock tree. And with this horrifying image, you'll never forget the right way to say hemlock woolly adelgid. Let's get back into it. This is a photo that probably everybody has seen at least once. It's probably the most commonly used depiction of HWA. This photo was taken along western shore of Cayuga Lake in Ithaca a few years ago. This shows a really high density of HWA on a hemlock branch. Each of these little white cottony swabs is an adelgid. So to get into a photo that you probably haven't seen very often is this close-up view. Notice the scale, 100 microns. This is an electron microscope photo. You can see these creatures are quite small, usually about 1 millimeter in length, maybe 1.5 millimeters at full size. They look a lot like raisins, if you ask me, but they are in fact insects. It might be hard to tell. There are no observable antennae, for instance, and you don't see eyes. They also don't have that classic three-part body plan that insects generally are attributed with. But they do have, let's see, 6 legs. Right there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, those are legs. They don't use them very much. You also see an ovipositor, that structure back there, and that's how you know this is a female adelgid. You also see this long wispy filament. That's actually the mouth of the adelgid. That's what we call the stylet. Those can be to upwards of 3 times the length of the body itself. We're also seeing these strange little divots on the sides of the adelgid. Those are actually the wool producing pores. Difficult to see in this image, but you see some of this cloudiness around it. I believe that's the wool. It's not captured in the image. Here's a close-up of the mouth parts. This is the stylet bundle, it's called. Like I said, that can be up to 3 times the length of the adelgid's body itself. This is kind of a straw-like mouth part inserted in the matrix of the parenchyma cells of the hemlock tissue. Generally, that's where water and nutrients are being moved around within the tree. The adelgid is tapping into that and feeding on that flow. This insertion of the mouth parts causes kind of a scarring response in the tree, which seals off the damaged regions. Unlike human mammalian bodies that might produce scabs and scars, trees tend to just wall off damaged areas. Feeding also slowly depletes the tree of nutrients and sugars. Pair this with kind of a reduced production in the tree through photosynthesis and loss of foliage. You eventually result in tree death and slow starvation. A close-up of those wool pores, very gross, but a neat image, I think. This is actually, it's not actually wool. It's more of a waxy filament. It's a Decatur ester wax. This filament is produced theoretically for thermoregulation, keeping the adelgid warm in the winter times. It's also protection from predators. It is pretty dense and messy and sticky. It's also theorized to be a good space for the eggs to be laid. So it's sort of performing as a nest for the adelgid eggs. And here we have a look at the egg clutch of the adelgids. The adult has been pulled away in this photo, or she might be buried down deep. Difficult to say. I don't remember, but the wool has been teased apart to expose the eggs. Let's see, the lighter pale eggs that you're seeing are probably the most recently laid. In fact, they are the most recently laid. The darker they get, it means the more mature they are. At a certain point, they start to segment a little bit and form little eye spots. What we're seeing here is the crawler form of the adelgid. So that's an egg that has hatched, and it's become this mobile stage. And that's the only time the adelgid is actually moving around on the tree. It's the only time it's moving from tree to tree is when it's in this form. The adults will kind of pick a spot, put their mouth in, and stay there until they expire. That said, these crawlers are only present at certain times of year. In fact, twice a year. It's depicted in this lovely life cycle chart. We see the crawlers here in July, and again here in late April to May. And this can vary a lot based on the temperature of the year. Peculiar thing about HWA is that they're not active at all during the summer months. And in fact, they look a lot different. Look like this. This is what you're looking for in the summertime, are these tiny little black sesame seed shaped spots on the tree. You can see this is really heavily magnified. These are the needles. Again, you can see those stomatal stripes. You can actually see the individual stoma in this photo. The adelgid has, the crawler has picked this spot, put its mouth part in to settle and hunkered down, and it'll stay that way throughout the summer months. There's no metabolic activity at this point. It's really just sitting there quietly. When the season begins to cool, talking September into October, that's when the adelgid, quote unquote, wakes up and starts growing. They'll shed their skin a few times, or exoskeleton, I should say. That's what we're seeing here. That's actually called the exuvia. You can see it split open a little bit. Here's the head segment and several other small body segments. That's pushed away as the wool grows, and they'll shed about 4 times before reaching full maturity. Getting back into the life cycle here. An important thing to mention is that there are 2 generations per year of hemlock woolly adelgid. We have what's called the Sistens generation and the Progrediens generation. The Greek or Latin, I'm not sure which root of these words. Sistens, to cease, to desist. Progrediens, to progress, to proceed. So Sistens have the longer life cycle, and they're the ones that are ceasing after they settle. So they settle as crawlers, and then they rest all summer long, called estivation, before waking up again and proceeding into the life cycle. Progrediens is much more truncated. They wake up and develop much more quickly. They don't have that estivation period. The important thing to take away from this is that there are 2 generations per year, laying eggs twice, and they're spreading twice. Another kicker with the HWA is that they are all female. All the adelgids we have here on the East Coast are female. They're asexually producing, and they're all laying eggs. No male adelgids whatsoever. Another bit of complication to all of this is that the hemlocks we have here are serving as technically the secondary host of the HWA. This is only a portion of their life cycle that we're experiencing when they're going through these 2 generations here. Primary host is actually what's called a tiger tail spruce, and that's present in Japan. Nowhere really out here except in maybe a few botanic gardens. When they are spreading to this, they've actually produced wings at this point, and they're flying off to this other tree. They do this here. They'll form these winged adults and fly away, but there's nowhere for them to go, and they just kind of die and disappear in the landscape. This is what the kind of final result of the spruce generation looks like. They form these galls. These are pretty common. You'll see them a lot on other gall-forming insects like goldenrod and oak apples. They're often called, very similar structures. Here is the full life cycle of the HWA, just to give you a sense. It has about 5 generations per year. Only one of those generations introduces sexual reproduction. The rest of it is all asexual. So what's the problem? Problem is that they reproduce like crazy, and they have massive fecundity. Each individual laying 50 to 100 eggs per generation. So that's twice a year. These individuals are laying 50 to 100 eggs. Each of those eggs becomes viable, and barring extreme climactic cold snaps, things like that, they develop to become adults and lay eggs themselves. This is very simple for them. Plenty of resources to feed and space to spread, and they don't have to waste any time with dating or meeting mates. This is a fun little graphic I found on the EC website that shows the expanse of HWA in the state. This is starting in 1980, I believe. You can see they're moving from the south to the north, spreading through Long Island and the Hudson Valley very quickly before making a jump into the Finger Lakes around 2009, I believe. But they really kind of get a nice foothold right there in the southern Hudson Valley and around the Catskills, sticking to these warmer microclimate areas where they're not experiencing very cold winters. I believe this ends on 2018. I'll let it play through one more time. I really like it a lot. Each of these little blocks is a municipality. Again, sticking to the Hudson Valley. The Lake Ontario Plain, it does really well too with stable winter climates. The Finger Lakes experiencing much the same thing. And expanding like gangbusters as winters start to warm. Here's a similar graph showing, a map showing the extent of HWA throughout the East Coast. The green being kind of the uninfested northern range of the hemlock. Here we're seeing these little disparate populations of Carolina hemlock. Both are infested by the HWA. Both are severely impacted. What I like about this graph a lot, so this is showing each color represents a decade. What we're seeing here is that in the south, where they have much warmer temperatures in the wintertime, HWA was spreading much more rapidly within that same time frame that we see up here, where they were only expanding about one county in that same 10-year period because of the colder winters, the same all the way up through the north. Very upsetting is this recent discovery in Nova Scotia. that was a nasty surprise for the Canadian government to see that expansive of an infestation. This map also shows the original kind of detection of HWA. It was in Virginia in 1951, around about, it was likely introduced on horticultural stock from Japan, where this hemlock woolly adelgid species is native. And here's a photo that shows the contrast between an HWA damaged tree and a relatively healthy individual. You'll notice that these are side by side. The spread of HWA is largely random. They're not spreading actively. Those little crawlers that I showed earlier aren't super capable travelers. They're often depending on pure happenstance. So they might catch a strong breeze or fall on the back of a bird or a deer and spread that way. This often results in sort of these patchy infestations on the landscape. And you might see some trees that are really heavily infested and damaged where others are not. This photo was taken likely in May or July. And what you're seeing is this really beautiful lime green, freshly produced foliage on the trees. So they're putting out these shoots every year. When they're heavily impacted by HWA, they're not doing that. And they take on this really grayish cast. You're seeing that they just look bad. There are a few spots that are producing some of that foliage, really struggling to put it out. If you ever happen to be out on the landscape and you're surveying for HWA, this is a really good thing to look for, these ghostly gray trees. This time of year is the best to do it. And this time of year, I mean, May, June, July. So are there any natural controls? No, not where we are. We don't have any native predators in the eastern US. Our increasingly warm winters lead to increased survivorship of overwintering generations, so they're not experiencing those cold snaps that really set them back. We also have no natural resistance in our hemlock trees. So this leads us to a couple of management options, and we divide that into short and long-term solutions. First, short-term solution being chemical intervention. And these are classic neonicotinoid chemicals. You've probably heard that term a lot in reference to honeybee collapse. The important thing when dealing with these chemicals in this context is that hemlocks are wind pollinated. There's no interaction with pollinating insects. So there's no exposure to those insects to these chemicals. These chemicals are introduced and they're acting systemically through the tree. So the only really interaction an insect would have with the chemicals is through direct contact, which is unusual. And we're not seeing that with pollinating insects. The two most commonly used chemicals are imidacloprid and dinotefuran. Both of these are neonicotinoids, but they have different active methods. Imidacloprid is a slow acting but long lasting. Sound like a pharmaceutical commercial. Dinotefuran is the fast acting and potent, but doesn't last nearly as long. So in conjunction, these are providing kind of a 5 to 7 year protection phase. They're often mixed in a container and applied at the same time. And depending on which chemicals you're using at any one time, it can really vary the cost. And the cost of these chemicals vary a lot year to year based on supply. But on average, it can be about $3 per inch for an application. These are limited and strictly regulated by the state. These applications are. So you can only apply what comes out to about 128 inches per year per acre. And that cost kind of boils down to $384. But like I said, this varies a lot. These chemicals can only be applied by certified applicators. These are state licensed professionals that can apply these chemicals. And here are a few of the methods that they use. We're seeing here a soil application, or soil drench it's often called. The top duff layer of the soil, all these leaves will be pulled away to expose the soil underneath. The chemical is poured directly on there and taken out through the root system. Another method is this stem injection, where they're actually drilling small holes into the tree, placing needles and injecting chemical directly that way. The other more common method that we see is basal bark spray application, where they're basically using this, what looks like a weed sprayer, to paint the tree up and down, usually about 4 foot of the tree all around. And that chemical is soaked up by the bark and taken up that way. So that's the short-term solution. What is the long-term solution? Well, it's biocontrol. Here we see two of the most commonly used, or the forefront of the biocontrol movement currently are these two individuals here. We see little Larry. This is Laricobius nigrinus, and little Luke. This is Leucotoraxis argenticalis. There are two species of each of these insects that are currently used. Most commonly, we'll see Laricobius nigrinus, and that's probably what I'll describe for the rest of this presentation. Leucotoraxis actually has two species that are commonly used in conjunction, but just for simplicity's sake, I'll call them Leucotoraxis. So you'll remember this map showing the various populations of hemlock throughout the world. Each of these species has an associated adelgid with them and associated predators systems. So when we're talking about biocontrol, we're going to areas where the HWA is occurring naturally and there are natural predators. We're taking those predators and introducing them here within our range. It gets complicated for a couple of reasons. One being that the HWA we have here on the east coast of the US came directly from Japan. This is Adelgis suges, the species of the Japanese lineage. The same species exists, the same species of HWA exists on the west coast on these other two species. It's the same Adelgid. The difference being that out here on the west coast, it is also native. It's a different lineage altogether. The Adelgid that we have came from Japan, evolved there, local predators there. The Adelgid that we see on the west coast likely originated in the same area, but has persisted on the landscape for hundreds of thousands of years and has naturalized in that way. So the trees on the west coast, Heterophila and Mertensiana, are resistant to HWA. It's all over the place out there, grows like gangbusters, but the trees aren't impacted by it. There's the resistance, but there's also the chemical, or the predatory insects that are helping keep things in check. At least that's the belief. So when we're working with biocontrol here on the East Coast, what we're often doing is traveling to the West Coast and collecting the predators there and bringing them back to the East Coast to introduce on our hemlocks. This process is really strictly regulated by the federal government. USDA APHIS is the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. This process, like I said, is really rigorously regulated. Sorry. Often there are various forms of testing, and it can take years to get permission to do these kinds of releases. And this ensures that the biocontrols that are being released in our area are not going to have any negative impact on other insects. Often you'll hear about the situation in Guam with cane toads and brown snakes, things like that. Biocontrol options really getting out of control, really akin to that story of the old lady who swallowed a fly, introducing one insect to eat another, and that becoming the problem. And it just kind of spiraling from there. This is all the research that is done is with the purpose of avoiding that situation. So the predators that I'm describing are specialist insects that can only survive on the HWA. And that is, they'll only eat HWA. They can't reproduce or complete their life cycle in the absence of HWA. This is a photo taken from the quarantine facility at Cornell. This foliage here in these plexiglass custom-made boxes is actually Western foliage. This is hemlock, Western hemlock, Tsuga dervecifolia, all heavily infested with HWA. You can see a little bit of it here, might be hard to make out. The idea here is that by collecting this foliage and shipping it back to the East Coast and the quarantine facility, we're able to collect those predators from the foliage as they emerge. And by doing this within these boxes, we're making sure we're not introducing the other lineage of HWA from the West Coast, nor are we introducing any of the other insects that might be hiding within. We also have to wear these uncomfortable Tyvek suits. Here's a look at the Laricobius nigrinus adult beetle foraging on hemlock woolly adelgid. You can see they're also quite small, but they are voracious and aggressive predators. They're doing is they're seeking out the HWA and just basically shredding those ovisacs, looking for the soft-bodied insects within. Evidence of these on the landscape is striking. When you're in an area that has these beetles, as well as the HWA, you can really tell almost right away because the ovisacs have been torn to shreds and it looks like a tornado has come through. A lot of that activity is due to the larvae. They're also very voracious predators and they're often eating the eggs. Both the larval and adult Laricobius feed on HWA adults and eggs. But there's a problem in that they have limited synchrony with the HWA population. So the Laricobius nigrinus has one population per year, and that's not going to keep up with the 2 populations a year that we're seeing for the HWA. So within these brackets, this is showing kind of the phase in which Laricobius, little Larry, is present and active. They're feeding on the cystins generation primarily, getting into the eggs a little bit, but then basically dropping off before they're also becoming inactive for the summer. So the Laricobius is active during the winter time, sleeping during the summertime in the soil. What we're seeing here is what's called a Progrediens rebound effect, where the adults have been feeding, the adult beetles have been feeding, do their best, then go to sleep, but they're not accounting for this grouping of eggs that has escaped that predator pressure. Those eggs hatch and spread, and the beetles haven't really done their fair share. So how do we combat that? Well, we consider a suite of predators. The other here being the silverflies, Leucotoraxis. These are also quite tiny. There's a little fly perched on the tip of my wife's ring finger. Here's a nice close-up. You see they are silver and they're quite beautiful. Here's a little video. I don't know if it's gonna work. It's not a video, but this is showing the larvae of the fly. It's actually feeding on the eggs of the HWA. You can see these kind of orange blobs here. Those are egg clutches for the adelgids. This kind of lighter gold silvery mass here is actually the egg case from the silver fly and the larvae that hatched from within. So the flies are laying their eggs directly on the eggs of the HWA. The fly larvae are emerging and feeding directly thereupon. Oh, here's the video. Now it's going. You can see the kind of gut in action a little bit there as it pierces the egg masses and kind of sucks out the juices within. Here are a couple photos of the actual release process for the predators. All that science and fancy looking lab equipment. And this is kind of the final result where we're tossing them into jars and releasing them into the forest. Not quite that simple, but that's really what it comes down to. You can see the flies here on the insides of these kind of old pretzel jars that were repurposed. What I'd like to say about these predators is that they've been released basically now all throughout the state of New York. Beetles and flies both have been introduced in most regions of the state where HWA is present, whether that be out to Lake Erie, all the way up to now Lake George, Paradise Bay, Shelving Rock area, all throughout the Catskills, all throughout the Hudson Valley, out through Finger Lakes and the Southern Tier. They've been released in a lot of places. Here's another look at those releases. This is Nick, he's still with Nice. He's releasing the beetles there directly onto the branch, and this is me watching them come out of the jars. The predator aspect is very promising in that they are actually being established throughout the state in these areas where they've been released. When I say they've been established, I mean that 1 year they've been released, subsequent years they've been detected in those same areas. So that means they're reproducing and establishing successfully in these areas, so thereby feeding on the HWA. And that's great. That's really common with the beetles, especially. They've been in action a lot longer. The flies have only been introduced in the past 6 years or so, maybe a little longer. But we now have establishment of both the insects within the state, which is really exciting. It does take a while for them to really become to grow their populations, to grow to an extent that it would be managing the HWA. So it's important to keep those trees treated until then, to keep the hemlock alive on the landscape and the food present for the insects to become established. With HWA and MHLC, since I started here, I found hemlock and HWA at almost every preserve we have. It's problematic, and the trees die within 8 to 12 years, just depending on where you are. The colder winters work in our favor, but that's becoming less reliable, as we're seeing today. To this effect, MHLC has formed a subcommittee of volunteers and board members to kind of explore feasible management strategies. I won't spend too much time on this. I don't know if Brian Ellis is on our call today, but this is a photo I took just in his backyard. Sorry, Brian, just a couple of days ago. This is up in Wolf Hollow near Amsterdam. This is basically the work plan for our subcommittee to find the hemlock, the adelgid, prioritize, collaborate, and find the monies to treat these trees. And here are the lovely committee members. Just want to give them a shout out. If anybody wants to join, I'm all for having more help. The more the merrier. Other resources and ways to engage. Of course, there's the New York State Hemlock Initiative that I mentioned. I encourage you to go to their website and check out their resources there. They have a lot of good literature to read through, as well as nice kind of sheets describing the chemical treatments and the processes there. Another good group to keep an eye out on is the Capital Region PRISM. That's the Partnership of Regional Invasive Species Management. Each region of the state has one of these PRISM groups. Our Capital Region PRISM is especially excellent. There's a great group of folks there. State parks and the DEC are also doing a lot of work in this regard. A lot of the treatments that have been carried out across the state have been done on state parks and state forest lands. And I'd love to introduce you to IMAP Invasives if you're not already familiar with it. This is an app that lets you document and share the location of invasive species wherever you are. And it's not just HWA, it can be really any kind of invasive, terrestrial, aquatic, insect, what have you. The most important thing I'd like you to take away from this today is that you should treat your trees if you have them. Like I said, it can be expensive. So I would encourage you to kind of figure out at what point you need to treat your trees. If they're infested, that's a good time to do it. If they're not, I wouldn't do it proactively. You can always reach out to me if you're curious about kind of the condition of your trees. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. There is a homeowner chemical, there's a chemical available to homeowners. It's called Bare Tree and Shrub, and you can buy it at most big box stores, I believe, like Lowe's or Home Depot. This is an imidacloprid formulation. Again, that's the slower acting chemical of the two that I discussed. And I think it's a lower concentration than what you might be buying from a commercial application, but the effect is generally the same. If you have just a couple of trees in your yard that you'd like to protect, this might be a good option for you to look into. Again, that's Bare Tree and Shrub soil drench. Reach out to me if you didn't catch that and want to hear it again. Right now with the IMAP invasives online mapping system, they have a little challenge. Apparently there's a prize available for whoever gets the most detections this year from the Hemlock Initiative. I have no idea what that is. Maybe it's a big bag of beetles that you can release on your tree. Who knows? But I encourage you to check that out and do a little get in on this challenge. I would love to see more of this done on our preserves. So with that, that's basically the end of my presentation. I know there's a lot that I didn't cover. I'm trying to keep it short just while everybody's eating their lunch today. This is something I love to talk about. You're welcome to give me a call or email anytime. I'm happy to talk more about it in depth. So I'm going to start my video again, close out of this, and say, hey guys. It doesn't seem like there are any questions in the chat, so that's good. Are there any questions now? You're welcome to shout them out, and I'll try to address them as best I can.
I have a question, Marshall. I have trees. I told you they were infested. I've treated them. I think mine really don't look as healthy as they used to. What kind of fertilizer is recommended for those trees? Not pesticide fertilizer.
Generally, anything with nitrogen is pretty good for hemlocks. There's a formulation of fertilizer. I'll have to figure it out for you, John, and I'll send it your way.
Thanks.
It's basically you want to balance the pH of the trees. Hemlocks prefer slightly acidic soils, so that's something you should focus on. That will release a lot of, or help them take up a lot of the other macronutrients in the soils.
I got pretty mature trees around my house. I mean, they're big, and there are a lot of them. There I got 10 or 15.
Mm-hmm.
And they just, I'd like to fertilize them
Yeah.
a little happier.
In a yard setting, probably that would be a good way to go. And you could always ask an arborist what their opinions are. Just ask a tree company. Don't let them come out and do it. You can always do it yourself. But
Yeah.
it is important to note that some fertilizers can actually be kind of a boon for the adelgids themselves, especially fertilizers that are high in nitrogen. That tends to help the adelgid more than it helps the tree. So that's something to keep in mind.
Oh, well, I don't seem to have adelgids around anymore since I've
That's good.
treated them.
Very good.
I look.
Just for other folks that might not have joined yet, John mentioned that he had sprayed his trees a couple of times now, and it cost him about $400 to do a few of them in his yard. So have you done that once every 5 years or so, John?
Yeah, that's about it.
But
and
it
I'm
helps.
looking very closely, but here's another question. I've always seen them at low levels. Is it, if they're at low levels, would they be up in the tree, or could they just be upstairs and you don't see them on the ground?
It could really be either way. It's hard to know.
I don't climb the trees.
Yeah, that's what you'd have to do. You can also just look around on the ground for branches that have fallen, especially after a windstorm. They might have fallen from the top. If you're seeing HWA there, you can assume that you've got it all throughout.
It was real obvious when they were there.
Yeah.
And I was looking because I've been aware of this a long time, and boy, they showed up quick.
That's a good point to mention, especially if you're in a really heavily forested area. Might not be your yards. You're not sure what the HWA circumstances are. Just keep an eye out on the ground. If you're seeing branches on the ground, pick them up and take a look. If you're seeing HWA there, that means the trees are infested. You might not be able to reach the branches, for instance, to check. So that's a good way to look. You can also look at the trunk of the tree itself. Often when it rains, the wool will be washed out and run down the bark, and you might see little masses on the trees. Any other questions?
So you think there's hope?
Yes, I think it's very hopeful. Probably one of the most optimistic situations that we have in forest health. The biocontrols, as I said, are establishing successfully, which is massive. That's huge. The chemicals are as affordable as they've ever been. Hopefully becoming more affordable in the near future. A lot of that has to do with patenting. But the adelgid moves pretty slowly. We have historically cold winters to help us kind of keep things at bay, keep them slowed down. We have time to deal with it. We have solutions. We just have to make sure we have the resources to keep applying them. This is, and when I think of other similar insects like emerald ash borer is a similar situation where they've an introduced species that's really detrimental to the trees. No natural resistance, no natural predators. The emerald ash borer moves a lot faster than HWA does, and that makes all the difference. There are biocontrols for EAB that are effective, but they can't keep up. So the EAB is killing these trees in just a couple of years and moving on, and that doesn't give management time to combat it. Whereas we do have that space cushion with hemlock.
Killed every tree on my property and around it, and it was quick, and they're all dead. I'm burning them now. They're falling over in the woods.
Yeah, that's all you can do. One of the chemicals that I described, that's the dinotefuran, so the faster acting of the two, actually does help with EAB, but that's also the most expensive of the two, and it's only going to be effective for about 2 years. So if you have cash to burn, it's a good way to protect your ash trees. Otherwise, there's not much you can do.
No, they're all dead. I'm burning them since they're now dead.
It's good firewood.
It's really sad. And they all show under the bark the little channels that the borer has formed.
Yeah. Any other?
Got anything for Asian bittersweet, which is killing all the trees down by the river, the Hudson? It just overgrows them.
I don't want to talk about bittersweet. That's more depressing.
Yeah, that's really depressing.
Yeah.
It's killing big mature trees by just overgrowing them. Oh boy.
There are researchers out there exploring biocontrols for all of these various invasive species, knotweed, bittersweet, buckthorn, All of it. There are generally insect associates with all of these in their native ranges, but whether or not they can be introduced here is the big question. So
we'll see you Sunday.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Is anybody else joining us for the walk on Sunday at Hollyhock? I see Paul's raising his hand. Dud, do you think you're going to come out?
I hope to. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let me introduce Dud actually while you're on here, if you don't mind, Dud. Dud also lives up in the Wolf Hollow area near Amsterdam and has a beautiful stand of hemlocks in his backyard. And he's contacted a contractor to treat his trees. He's taking the plunge and doing the right thing. And definitely want to give him a shout out for that hard work. If anybody is interested in kind of working with Dud to bag a contractor, often, there are only a few of these people in the state that can do this. And they're looking for the bigger contracts if they're going to travel. So if there are groups of people that are willing to treat their trees, that helps a long way in convincing the contractors. And if you want to jump in with that, I think he's always looking for folks.
It works well. It kills the hemlock adelgid goes away and the tree doesn't die.
It really does. And the trees can rebound from being in pretty bad shape. They're really resilient. So it's almost always worth it. Oh, glad to see you up there, Jeff.
Have you found, do the recommended insecticides have any effect on the predator insects that may be introduced?
So they would, but because of these insecticides are designed specifically to work on arthropod insects, their nervous system disruptors. So the predators would be susceptible to these chemicals. However, the only way they'd be taking up these chemicals is if they're eating adelgids that have already consumed it. Think of the food chain there, because the predators aren't feeding on any of the foliage or anything like that. They don't have any exposure. If the predators were eating dead adelgids, then probably they would, but they won't do that. They only go for the living adelgids, and living adelgids ostensibly haven't been in contact with the insecticide. Yeah. Good question, though.
I want to thank you very much for the presentation. It's very informative.
Yeah, my pleasure. Like I said, I'm always happy to talk about this. I was trying to move through things pretty quickly today, this little slideshow. But please feel free to reach out anytime. And the folks at Cornell are really informed and happy to help too.
If there's any links to materials or other reading that we could look at, for example, the whole thing about the life cycle, very complicated. I'd be interested in reading more about that.
Sure.
So, if anything you can post, let me know.
What I can do is send around an email to everybody who was involved today with a few links. I'd be happy.
That'd be
good. Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely do that. I think there are a few repositories that I can direct you to as well for you to browse.
Yeah, it's accessible to somebody like me who doesn't have any knowledge of biology or whatever.
Or academic credentials to get into those.
Yeah.
Expensive.
Well, that was pretty impressive, actually. Say that was more detailed and specific than I was expecting.
It's a complicated bug. There's a lot of information there. It's a lot to tease apart. Yep. For those that are going to be joining Sunday, I'll talk some more about some of the nuances and happy to answer more questions.
Okay.
I think it really helps to see the stuff in person. Yeah. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'm happy to stay on here and we can just keep chatting if you guys want to. But if there aren't any other questions, we can let everybody go and
get on. Good. Thank you.
Beautiful rainy day. Yeah. Thank you so
much, Marshall.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Marshall. Thank you very much.
For sure. Yeah. Take care.
See you Sunday.